Welcome to the Scalable Real Estate Investing Podcast, where we discuss the most scalable strategies, tools, and approaches to successfully invest in real estate. Learn how to make the most impact of your time, automate your real estate investing business, find off-market deals with minimum time invested, and leverage your capital to create as many income streams as possible so that you can achieve true financial independence. Thank you for tuning in. I'm your host, Mason Clement. Hi, Scalable Investors. Thanks for tuning in to another episode of Scalable Real Estate Investing. I'm your host, Mason Clement, and today we have with us Mike Marshall. And if you haven't heard of him already, you're definitely going to hear of him as time goes on. He's already making a big name for himself in subdivisions and land entitlements. And so I think it's going to add a lot of value and bring in a different perspective to how you invest in land. He's the founder of Tolosa Property Group. You can also go over to entitleandflip.com to check out what he has going on, has a mastermind, and really just excited to unpack what he's got and what he's working on. So Mike, what's going on? How you doing?
Good. Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Sure. So you have over 20 years experience doing this type of work. So why don't you just talk about your background and what made you want to get into this and what brought you up to today?
Sure. I kind of grew up with real estate in my family. My dad had, some multifamily property when I was younger, and I ended up doing a lot of work on those properties with him over the weekends and stuff. So 12, 13 years old, was sweating it out with dad, doing some of that kind of stuff. And I always had that interest in real estate. And coming out of college, I ended up getting a job for a local city here in an area that was completely outside of real estate or development or anything like that. But anyway, I ended up kind of finding planning and zoning basically as like this avenue to get into real estate through a job. Basically, it was like, hey, I could work in the realm of real estate and development and still get a paid job at the time. And I was, pretty young. So it sounded pretty attractive. And so I got into it that way, kind of through the back door. And over time, I worked in cities in both here, California, as well as Texas. Ended up working on everything from, custom single family homes up to 1,200 lot residential subdivisions to medical office buildings and everything in between. And, honestly, towards the end of that time, working for jurisdictions, working on a movie and studio campus. So like 1.4 million square foot, movie and studio campus. And so over time, worked on a whole variety of different projects. And ultimately in that time is really more focused on the entitlements phase of the development process, and development can kind of be chunked into three categories. One would be like the planning or entitlement phase. Then the second phase might be the engineering phase. And then the third phase would really be building and safety and your building permit phase. So I was really working in that first phase in the actually planning and entitlements and getting those approvals from the jurisdiction prior to actually building.
Okay. So the entitlements, basically the legal process of just getting that approval to from the county or the city to start building. Before you can actually break ground, you have to go through that process. Is that right?
Yeah, that's correct. So there's a variety of different entitlement types. Entitlements are just an umbrella term, and underneath that you may have subdivisions and rezonings and site plan reviews and conditional use permits, and there's all sorts of types of entitlements that fall under that umbrella. And ultimately the most important thing is that when you get an entitlement, it really vests a right on that property. Once you're approved, that property can never be taken away from having that right to develop. And so it runs with the land, in perpetuity. You can never take it away. And so what it does is it adds certainty, and that certainty is what creates the value ultimately.
Okay. Yeah, that makes a ton of sense. And basically one of the strategies is to bring it through that entitlement process and then sell it to a developer or a builder. Is that basically the play?
Yeah, the play is essentially that. Yeah, you have a couple places where you can exit off, right? The way that I talk about it and what I promote is really exactly that, is that you find the opportunity, you get it entitled, and then you sell off to usually a developer. It may be, mom and pop home builder too, if it's just a custom single family house, something like that they're looking to build. But ultimately what you're doing is you're creating a package of approvals that you're going to basically sell off as part of the property itself. And that's going to usually go to a developer, a builder, or something like that of some kind. That's the traditional way of doing it, and if you wanted to, you could take it a step further and, get the engineering permits and things like that, and sell it off like partially developed, where you have like all the horizontal improvements done on site. And then you could even take it a step further and actually go and get the building permits and build on site too. So you can do the actual physical development as well. I just advocate, just based on my experience, is really, focus on what I'm an expert in the entitlements portion of it, and then sell off to somebody else that is more, has a business model that's about going vertical, and a lot of these developers, they don't want to take on the entitlement process if they don't have to. They make their money going vertical. So they'd rather take on a project that's already entitled and already has that sense of certainty, and they can just take it and run with it.
Okay. Yeah, what I've learned is when I've spoken with some builders, they don't really do the horizontal development. So like a developer, it's kind of a loaded term. It's like, well, is that vertical or horizontal development?
100%. Yeah. It's like you're using these terms interchangeably. And then even I do it a lot too, and you're right. I think that if I were to like kind of compartmentalize it in the most clear way, I'd say is that a developer will usually, they may go get the entitlements, but then they're also going to do a lot of the horizontal improvements, and they're going to usually turn it over to a builder. And the condition that they're turning it over to the builder in is they'll have the entitlements, they'll have maybe all the rough grading done, they may even have the pads set for the house, and what they call blue tip condition or blue tip ready. So that way the builder comes in and they're just going to go vertical. It's already set up and ready to go. So the developer will do the entitlements, but the major portion of what they're doing are all the horizontal improvements, putting in the roads, things like that. But then the actual builder will come in and, actually go vertical on the houses. And that's like, DR Horton, Shea Homes, places like, people like that.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So one of the biggest things I've been kind of nervous about, obviously you got to lock up these properties, sometimes take them down with your own money. And just to have that time frame to do that, the whole process, the entitlement process. And one thing I've been thinking is, well, how do I know what that buyer is going to want? So, because it seems like the best thing to do would be to find the buyer first, ask what they want, and reverse engineer and go out and find what they're looking for, and then do the stuff. Is that pretty accurate?
Yeah. I mean, that in an ideal world, that's exactly the way that I'd want to do it, is go and like talk to a builder, and most oftentimes I'm not dealing with the big DR Hortons and those, because those are just huge acreage properties. So these are more like regional home builders, these kind of smaller builders that are dealing with. But yeah, I'm going to reach out to them directly, get a sense for what it is that the product type that they're building. Are they doing single family homes, or are they doing attached townhomes? What kind of product type are they actually building? Because you're right, you want to be able to reverse engineer it. All that said, if you're going to go and get like an approval for a single family subdivision, standard, single family fee lots, ultimately you're maybe going to get approval for the actual building footprints and things like that. You may get approval for the architecture. So you may get approval for a lot of these things. And then if the builder comes in and they want to change stuff, there are avenues for them to tweak and change it, so it's not 100% set in stone. So it's not as though if you get something approved and they don't like it, then there's no hope, it's not as though you have to match it and read their minds. Essentially, it's much better to do it the way you said it. But ultimately, if you have to move forward without having an exact buyer in mind, or if you have like 2 or 3 buyers in mind, there is avenues to adjust those approvals.
Okay, got it. Yeah, I think on a different episode I was watching, you were talking about there's certain like percent deviation that's acceptable before they have to go through the whole entitlement process again.
Yeah, exactly. And it's it varies based on jurisdiction, but there might be a situation where, hey, if there's a 10% deviation, they may be able to do it administratively. If it's like a 10 to like 50% like deviation, then there might be some other permit, like it's like a minor level permit, that you have to go through. And then if it's over 50%, then you have to actually go through the whole process all over again. And when I say those percentages, it's kind of ambiguous in terms of what are they measuring, but the most common one is going to be unit count. So if you're going to go and increase the number of units, then that's going to maybe trigger something. If you're going to go and tweak with the architecture slightly here and there, that's usually something that can be done administratively and doesn't require you having to go through a set of hearings or anything like that.
Okay. Is it really necessary to hire an architect if you're just doing the subdivision and entitlement? If you're not breaking ground?
Yeah, a lot of times it's not. You're always going to need a civil engineer. I say always, about 80% of the time, you're always going to need this like civil engineer because they're doing a lot of that work. They're doing all the site planning. They're doing, the hydrology work for drainage on site. They're doing a lot of utility stuff. So they're really instrumental in all of it. The architect, you're only going to need them in terms of actually getting, architectural elevations, all of the aesthetic stuff that makes it look pretty. That's really where they're going to come in for the most part. They're going to maybe do stuff with floor plans and stuff like that, but it just depends on what the jurisdiction requires. And so if you're just going to do the subdivision, then generally speaking, you're not going to need the architect. If you're going to get like the building placement set, things like that, then you might end up needing the architect, but it'll be to a limited degree.
Okay. Yeah. And then it goes back to like, well, building set and location. Like, I don't really even know all the specifics. That's what starts to get me nervous. It's like, I don't know. I'm not the guy building it. Like,
Yeah, right. Yeah. So like if you're looking at like, well, where do you want the footprint to be placed? If you're creating like, 5,000-6,000 square foot lots, there's not going to be a lot of options, right? Because you have to meet certain setback requirements and things like that. And then, it's just going to be that it fits or it doesn't. So in those kind of situations, it's pretty much straightforward. If you get larger acreage lots, then yeah, it gets a little bit different because now you're looking at what's the most advantageous place to put it. Is there, some sort of clearing where there's not as many trees? Is there some area where you're out of the flood zone? All of those things. When you're looking at, a lot that's like kind of like a nearly finished lot, a lot of those issues have already been dealt with on the macro level because they're looking at like this large scale subdivision. But all that said, the civil engineer is really, again, your friend in this. If there's something that's local and they've done local work and everything like that, they're going to be familiar with a lot of these requirements. And so they're just basically the kind of like the one that's doing the heavy lifting, and you're going to be managing over it. So the thing that I talk to people about is that, you don't have to be the subject matter expert. You just need to be a good project manager to be able to do this.
got it. Because you're following up with your civil engineer with the city and county folks and just making sure everything's moving forward, managing it.
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly it. And it's a good point you bring up too. You can't just work just with your engineer or whoever your professional service provider is. You gotta work with the city too. So you got to take that accountability, because sometimes what'll happen is you'll hear from the engineer that, oh, it's being delayed by the city or something like that. And that may be true, but sometimes it's the other way around. And so you're gonna have to be the glue between all the pieces to make sure everything actually works good.
Yeah. Just like coordinating any just simple flipping transactions. I have to coordinate with the seller, title company, everyone else, and in between, surveyor.
Yeah, exactly. Like everybody's motivated to get the project or the deal done, but you have to take control because it's your deal, right? So that still applies.
Yeah, I definitely don't want to be a day before closing date and the survey is not even ordered yet.
Right.
I've had,
Right.
I've had stuff like that happen where it's like, oh, the lender didn't order the appraisal. And it's like, well, why didn't you contact the lender a month ago? Because we had 3 months to do this.
Yeah.
It's crazy.
Yep. Exactly.
So I know that last time we spoke, you said that typically the easiest thing to do is start out with subdivisions. So the obvious thing to do is just build your list based on some certain minimum type acreage, but it probably can't be just anywhere. So how would you go about just building a list that is actually viable for subdivisions?
Right. So I think the first thing to realize that there's, again, in the world of entitlements, there's a whole different myriad of different entitlements. And yes, subdivisions is probably the first entry point, and it makes the most sense to land investors because, if you haven't done a subdivision, you're definitely familiar with the concept. And so it's an easier transition. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that, there's a variety of different types of subdivisions too. And at its most common level that everybody's really more familiar with is like, almost like a master planned community residential subdivision that a lot of folks live in. We're used to like the roads and the amenities and all these other things. And that's kind of like the big type of subdivision, or a major subdivision. And then you have another type of subdivision, which will be smaller land divisions that are called minor subdivisions. And the classifications and the criteria that's associated really does vary from state to state and even county to county to some degree. But these are like kind of smaller subdivisions. They may not have roads in them. They may have roads in them. There may be some limited type of improvements, but they're smaller scale subdivisions. And then there's like this other type of subdivision that's what we'd call exempt or accepted subdivisions. And that's not like that's not an official name. It's kind of what I call them. But there are states throughout the country where if you're dividing up the property and the resulting parcels are of like a certain acreage size, for example, you can do that without actually having to go through the county approval process. All you need is a land surveyor, and they're just going to create a meets and bounds description, and they're going to go and actually just record it at the county. And you don't have to go through like a review and public hearing and all these kind of things. So it's still technically a land division. You're still creating separate lots, but you just have to meet certain criteria. And so in some states, it might be, hey, every resulting parcel has to be 10 acres in size or larger. Or in another state, it might be anything that's 4 lots or less, can be done, through this type of process. So it's not every state that has these type of exemptions. There's only, maybe like a third or so of the states have these type of exemptions, but those are great places to start. And so people that are in our group, we've done a lot of that research for them. We have that list and it basically says, here's all the places that you kind of can go and target and start out with. Because they're easier, especially if you're just getting into subdivisions and everything like that, it's an easier place to start. Now, this type of thing isn't necessarily very widely known because, jurisdictions don't really publicize it very much. They don't, want to publicize, hey, go through a process that we're not involved in. And the reason why they don't really, review them is because most times those exceptions require that you're not installing any roads or any improvements like utilities even or something like that. So it's not a lot for them to review, and that's why you don't have to go through the process. So this kind of subdivision works really well for recreational land, for hunting land, things like that. And it can also work good for housing tracts too that are on the urban fringe. These areas where you'll have some subdivisions, but you're still surrounded by some farmland and stuff like that. And you can see that there's this momentum moving. You can still do those types of subdivisions and do really well too. And there's some states that actually have it as low as 5 acres too. So just kind of be aware of that.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. I know that I was working on one where it's like 3 acres, and I was talking to the county about, well, what if I just subdivide this into like 2 1.5 acre lots? And that was a good example of where I don't think I would have had to go through the whole process. They just said, yeah, you just submit that survey and then we'll approve it within 30 days.
Yeah, so that'd be kind of more like what I call like a minor subdivision. So they still have a process technically, but it's really minor. It's really basic and straightforward. And that happens a lot when you're just doing lot splits where you're going from 1 to 2. A lot of states have that kind of exception or that kind of process to make it easy just to split your lot. So just if you're going to go and do that can be really valuable, especially that can be valuable in more urbanized settings where you have like a larger lot that has an existing single family house. And it just so happens that you may be able to split it in 2 and make that a suitable site for something else.
Yeah, that's another interesting play I've looked at where the house was on like one side of a 5 acre parcel. And I was like, oh, we could split that off and have like a 2 acre and then a 3 acre. And they have like 2 different deals going concurrently after we divide it. So.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it allows you to be really creative ultimately, and do that, and kind of look for different product types and different end users that you're kind of suiting for. So yeah, there's a lot of room for that.
Okay. So when you're considering these properties, I mean, is it necessarily the highest and best use is like housing or hunting, or how do you really determine that like this is what this property should be used for?
Right. I think the first thing is to really look at the zoning of the property and see what the jurisdiction is saying that they envision to be the highest and best use. Now, granted, especially in some more rural areas, you may have unrestricted land and there is no zoning. And so if there is no zoning on the property, then generally what I'm looking at is, well, what is the surrounding, development pattern? What's going on in the relative immediate area? If there are houses, then, I want to fall in line with that. If it's more recreational tracts, then I want to fall in line with that. And the only reason I say that is because if you're trying to go and create like a highly dense residential subdivision in an area where there's this recreational land, you're going to get opposition from the people that own the property around it. But you're also going to get opposition from, anybody that's going to approve the project. Even though there's no zoning, they're still going to have these general plans or comprehensive plans that are going to basically have these findings that are going to require them to say, hey, if we're going to approve this, we have to make sure that it's consistent with surrounding development. So even if you don't have zoning, you still have to have some consistency. There's room to vary, of course, and push the envelope a little bit, but you really can't go and just do something that's completely starkly different. So that's with a property that doesn't have zoning. With a property that does have zoning, then the cities or the county is already saying, hey, this is what we envision to be the highest and best use for the property. And so in that case, you could look at it and say, all right, I'm just going to build out to what the zoning allows for, build out in terms of what's the maximum I can get on the current zoning. So that's one way to go. And then the other way to go is that if you look around the property, you're saying, well, hey, you know what, this is like a single family zone, but right next to me is a multifamily zone and a commercial zone and those kind of things. And it's the zones are just different zoning. And then at that point, you can look at the opportunity to rezone the property, especially when you're directly adjacent, to those types of zones. That's how you would end up determining, well, now I can really look at really improving the property and creating a new highest and best use by rezoning the property.
Okay. How difficult is that to rezone? I mean, it's a loaded question. It depends probably.
Yeah. I mean, it definitely depends, on the jurisdiction you're in. But then I'd say too that it's also a matter of kind of what's going on around the property again. So if you're in a single family zone and you're right next to a commercial zone or right next to a multifamily zone, you're going to have a much better shot at getting that approved. If you're in a single family zone and you're surrounded by single family zoning, then they're not going to really support that. That's what they call spot zoning. And they're never going to go and say this one parcel can be, zoned residential, then the next one commercial, then the next one industrial. It just creates situations where you have, non-compatible land uses, and that's where you get problems, and that's why zoning was established to begin with, was to prevent the problems that happen when different use types interface. So if you have a hog farm right next to a residential subdivision, that's never going to work, and so that's why zoning was created. And so the same thing applies. They're not going to approve a zone change that's a spot zoning situation. But there is, so anyway, it is a lengthy process sometimes, and it can be expensive. But again, in terms of like the difference between areas, I always talk about somebody I know that did a rezoning project, and it was in Michigan, and it cost like $750, and it maybe took them like 4 or 5 months, if I remember right. And then in California, where I'm at, that same process would take maybe close to a year, and it would be probably about, I don't know, $35,000 just in application fees. And so it depends on where you're at. Some jurisdictions are very much in favor of doing zone changes if it makes sense. Some are very adverse to it, and it just depends on where you're at.
Okay, that actually brings me to my next question. If I'm just cruising around sourcing deals and looking at my capital, my bank, how much of a budget should I have? How much cash buffer to like pay that civil engineer and go through the process? So, again, probably depends. Like in California versus Texas, like how would you look at those two different budgets?
Yeah, I would definitely say the California budget is going to be more just because of the regulations and the loopholes that you go through, and the regulations in terms of the work that they have to do to be able to show their work and demonstrate that that's actually complying with those standards. If you take a project, in California and compare it to one that's in Texas, and you're trying to see, and if they're the same exact project, let's say on the same exact property, just one's in California, one's in Texas. I mean, I think you're looking at entitlement fees in and of themselves are easily going to be 2 to 3 times the amount. And that's the fees. The entitlement fees aren't really where the costs come in. The costs are going to come in professional services, like the engineers and everything like that. The engineers are probably not going to be 2 to 3 times as much, but it might be like 50% or so more, something along that line. But again, you're paying them basically on an hourly basis most oftentimes. And so that's the thing. So it's 50% more maybe on an hourly, but the amount of hours that's taking them to get a project done could actually be significantly longer too, just because again, the regulations that are in place. But so it's a weird thing because I always say that, and people will say, well, it's expensive and it's too difficult to do it in California. And I get that, but the other side of the coin is that the property values are that much more, and so the actual return is, commensurate with that too. So it's higher risk, higher reward, basically.
Yeah, that makes sense. But like ballpark minimum, I should probably have like $10,000 set aside to pay a civil engineer, or 20.
Yeah. I mean, if you're going to do like, let's say like a standard, 4 or 5 lot subdivision, and you're doing that in California, yeah, definitely having that 10,000 set aside. If you're going to do like a basic exempt subdivision, like I'm talking about, and it's in Texas, and you're creating these 10-acre lots, and you're just needing a land surveyor, then it's going to be something probably a little bit less. But again, the whole thing I would always say is that before you get under contract, is try to work those numbers into your overall estimate before you do that, or at minimum, at least do that during your due diligence period.
Okay. So even after you get it approved and you've paid the engineers and all the entitlement fees, there's conditions of approval. So do you feel like there's ever a condition of approval that it's going to be a deal killer for your buyer that you should be aware of?
I mean, that's a great question. I mean, that's kind of like the masterclass type of question, because yeah, it can be. And so sometimes it's not as straightforward as I'm saying in terms of just getting it approved and then passing it on. That's the goal, of course. But you do have to be cognizant of what those conditions of approval actually are and what they require. And so one of the it's always going to come down to cost one way or the other, whether it's fees that they're paying, or it's, improvements that are required, or maybe even some cases it's land that has to be dedicated for like roadway expansion and next to the property, something like that. So you do have to go through this process where you review those conditions of approval before you actually accept them. Usually what will happen is they're going to issue these conditions of approval, and then you have to sign and notarize an acceptance form that basically says, I accept these conditions of approval. Even though the city or the county are issuing the conditions, the true reality is that they are open for discussion. You can try to push and negotiate those down, whether it be those fees or whatnot. So yeah, the deal killer in of it all, just in general, is to be able to kind of reduce the fees ultimately. Sometimes you're not going to be able to reduce the requirements for improvements. Sometimes you will, but the goal is to be able to look at each of those conditions of approval and determine which ones are going to be the most costly and which ones you want to actually go and see if you can negotiate down somehow. So you can do that, prior to accepting the conditions of approval. That's very much true. The reality is once you do sell off the property, though, it is possible for the developer to go in and try to negotiate those down. That becomes a political situation at that point. And, they'll tell you that you can't do that. But the reality is that, it's negotiable up until the moment you're paying that check, And the thing that happens too is that a lot of times what it'll be is that you get these entitlements in place and they're approved, and there may be a fee that's due, and the fee will seem acceptable now today, but really the fee isn't due until they pull building permits. Well, if they wait a year or two until they actually pull building permits, those fees are going to go up. And that's not your fault as a guy that's getting it entitled. That's really their doing. And so they have to be cognizant of that and may have to negotiate those down at that time.
Okay. Yeah, that's really interesting. But hopefully you've already sold to the buyer, you've cashed your check, and you don't have to worry about it. I don't know.
Right, exactly. And that's the hope, that you've already done that. In reality, it's kind of looking at those conditions and saying, okay, what's realistic, or what's, fair, or what makes sense. I mean, I'll give you an example. Like, some jurisdictions, they'll make it that where you have these, you have your power lines that are running across like the front of the property. And they'll say like, hey, anything over a certain voltage and size, you're going to have to underground those utilities, because ultimately what they're trying to do is, from an aesthetics perspective, they don't want power lines running down their commercial corridors, for example, or even in residential areas. And so over time they try to be able to do that, and so they'll put that on the developer to actually underground those utilities. It's extremely expensive to do that. And so a lot of times what like the savvy developer will do is they'll come in and they'll try to negotiate a fee in lieu of that. And basically they understand that, hey, it's going to cost, X thousands of dollars to be able to do that undergrounding. And I'm just going to be able to negotiate this fee down and pay a fee in lieu. And it's going to be cheaper for me to do it. And I don't have to deal with the hassle of it down the road. And so it's things like that where you're looking at, okay, what's the cost of me doing that? Can I do a fee in lieu and get through it and be able to be in substantial conformance with the condition? It's things like that. there's things like, you know, hey, I have to connect to the sewer line for the sanitation district and they have a sewer connection fee. I'm not going to be able to get around that. That's just going to be what it is. But there are certain things that are a little bit more nuanced and more subjective that you'll be able to kind of attack. And if you want to add value to your developer, to your buyer, you go and you try to do those kind of things. And then you can convey that to them and say, hey, look, your fee was this before, but now I've negotiated it down to this. And if they're actually competent and experienced in that area that you're working in, they're going to see the value in the fact that you just save them a lot of money, you know. So that's another kind of value play that's hidden in all of it.
Okay. Yeah, just to piggyback on that, I know I was working on a self-storage deal, and they didn't have like a real valid certificate of occupancy on file. So it wasn't even like an entitlement or rezoning. Well, I guess it technically was, because they weren't even like entitled to run the self-storage business. It wasn't even zoned for that. And they've just been operating without a CO and like without proper zoning for like 15 years. And then when I asked for, hey, how do I get a permit to put in a new fence? They're like, well, we're not gonna let you do that because first you have to, you know, bring it up to code and get that valid CO. And so I just mentioned all that because it would have cost me like a couple $100,000 to do their requirements, which was like plant these little shrubs every X feet, plant some trees. Oh, and they got to be live oak trees with like 4 to 5 inch diameter. And then you have to install irrigation for those. And it's like, well, wait a minute, there's no water on that side of the highway. So I got to bore underneath the highway. It started to become extremely complicated.
Right. And that's probably in part why the current operator went and did it without the permits. And then they went and, you know, operated for how long ever they did. And it's a weird thing because a lot, I understand it from a business operator's perspective. They just look at it from the cost essentially. So, you know, I can go and operate in this way that's technically not approved, or I go and I meet their standards. But if I go and do that, I'm just not going to be able to afford to, you know, exist anymore, you know? And so it's a very simple computation for a business owner when they're looking at it from that perspective. But yeah, in that scenario, you know, they don't have an approved land use. And so in that situation, they're not going to get a permit for anything. So even if they got like a portion of like a portion of the structures were damaged due to a storm or something like that, and they need to go and replace something and it requires a building permit, they're not going to get a permit for it. They're not going to get any approval for anything because they have an unapproved land use and they have to go through whatever permitting process would be required. And if it's prohibited in that zone, then they're even in a worse spot because the only way they're going to be able to fix that is go through a rezoning process. And more than likely the city or the county wouldn't really support that because otherwise they would have it zoned that way to begin with. It's an uphill climb to get there. And then when you do get it approved, the conditions of approval are going to be able to do all those things you just mentioned, all the landscaping and everything else, you know, to bring it up to code. So yeah, that's a sticky situation that takes a lot of like kind of nuance to navigate through. And in that situation specifically, you're having to negotiate every single thing to try to bring your price down because it's going to be costly to bring it up.
Yeah, exactly. That's why I had to just kill the deal. I even tried to wholesale it to some other investors. They're like, it was stupid. It was a zombie deal. I was trying to bring back to life. And I knew that no one else would want to take that on either. Because I was open. And I was like, look, here's what you have to do. If you're interested, buy it. But yeah.
It's a weird thing though, too, in that like, as much as there's like so much hair on something like that, the reality is that if you can untangle it though, then, you know, you're doing something that a lot of people can't do. And so like, for me, I would look at it and go, okay, I want to know exactly what you guys want, line item by line item. I want to be able to price that out. I want to be able to time that out. I want to be able to look at what's the political reality of me getting approved for rezoning if I needed to, and basically go into it and go and looking like, look, you know, I'm not the owner now, but I'm somebody that has the ability, skills, and knowledge to fix this problem for you as the city. But in order to do that, I need you to kind of give on some things too. So I need to be able to have this as a partnership because I understand that you as a city want this to be a certain way. I want to be able to do that for you too, but I can't do it on a dollar for dollar basis. So I'm going to need you to kind of help me in certain places to make this work. Otherwise, I'm just going to walk away and it's going to remain that way. And that will work for some jurisdictions and some of them won't. And it depends on how active their development community is, you know, and everything like that. This is what the challenge is between a city or a county and then a developer is that oftentimes the developer is looking at it from like a 3 to 5 year window. They're looking to actually go develop the property, stabilize it, and then sell it, and that's like, maybe a 3-year, 5-year, something like that window. But a city or county, they're creating their comprehensive and general plans for the course of 25 to 30 years. So they're taking a long view of it, and a developer takes a comparatively shorter view of it. And because of that, that creates these kind of headbutting that goes on, where a city can say, that's fine, we'll just wait it out. And then that doesn't really work for a developer.
Yeah, it's funny you say that. It's exactly what was happening here. I saw their master plan of this beautiful downtown area, but like right now it's just some old rusty railroad tracks and stuff. But it was very, very clear that they would never approve that rezoning. And it would need to be like, it was currently like commercial 1 for like a Starbucks type of, restaurant retail use. You would need at least a C2, and then actually safer to do an industrial zoning for it. And I was like, yeah, this is just impossible. They're never going to approve that. Like the only guy in that area that had industrial zoning was some guy who really plugged into local politics. And I don't even know if that was because he rezoned it or he just was smart enough to buy it zoned as industrial in the first place. But
yeah, it's interesting. The other thing I'd say too is that, look at it from the perspective of going kind of like we're talking about reverse engineering something, going to the city and saying, what is it that you ideally see here? Do you see it as like this retail Starbucks kind of situation? Is that what you really want? Is that what you're envisioning? And if that's the case, then I want to work to see if I can actually deliver that. Is there a way that I can actually deliver? Now we're talking about Starbucks in this example, but it can apply to anything. And if it's Starbucks, then I start reaching out, and seeing like, hey, who, is there an interest, what architecture firms work with Starbucks? They have the context, in that scenario. So I start kind of reaching out to those people. I reach out to like local brokers and stuff like that. And so if there's another Starbucks that's like local to my area and there's like a broker that has like a sign out front because they're leasing adjacent spaces, I start talking to them, and I start trying to reach out, because if there's a way that I can deliver it and be that person that's the glue between all of it, then there's an opportunity potentially there too.
okay. Yeah, that's really interesting. I know you have a hard stop coming up. I definitely could speak about all this all day, but we have other stuff to do. So what's the best way for people to get in touch with you and learn about what you're doing?
Absolutely. The best way is just to go to our website, entitleandflip.com. That's ENTITLE and flip.com. And on there, you're going to see all our different resources. You're going to see information about our coaching program. And our coaching program is all about these kind of deals, whether it be subdivisions or more advanced entitlements, moving into commercial stuff. We kind of meet you where you're at and what you want to do. But you can get all that kind of information there. And if you have any questions, you can actually set up a free 15-minute call with me, and we can kind of go over, how this can dovetail into your existing business.
All right, perfect. Well, as always, really appreciate your time. I think this is very helpful. I hope that it's added a lot of value to listeners as well. So thanks again for jumping on the show.
Absolutely. Thanks a lot.
All right, that's another episode of Scalable Real Estate Investing. Thank you for tuning in. Please be sure to leave a review and subscribe on whatever channel you're using to listen or watch these episodes. And also be sure to go to scalablerealestateinvesting.com, scroll to the bottom, and fill out the form to sign up for our email. And you could also reach me directly at mason@scalablerealestateinvesting.com. That's MASON at scalablerealestateinvesting.com. If you'd like to get in touch with me to either partner on deals or even be considered to do your own episode on this podcast. Thanks again, and have a great day.